from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, All and Everything. Chapter 43. Beelzebub's Survey of the Process of the Periodic Reciprocal Destruction of Men, or Beelzebub's Opinion of War. Well, now, my boy, after this digression which I have made for your practical benefit, let us return again to the serious question touched upon. I shall begin with the history promised you about how the Society of Terrestrial Beings, which had as its motto, "The earth is equally free for all," arose and fell, because the information about this will give you the possibility to understand well just about that first and chief cause why there on your planet this terrible process of periodic reciprocal destruction by these unfortunate three-brained beings of our great megalocosmos must already, almost inevitably proceed. And likewise you will learn how the, so to say, local nature, when something unforeseen hinders its correct functioning for the purposes of the common cosmic trago-auto-ecocrat, adapts itself so that its results should correspondingly blend with the harmony of this most great cosmic law. The said Society of Terrestrial Beings, men, arose, as I have already told you, 6 or 7 centuries ago, on the continent Asia, in a town then existing under the name of Masulopolis. And it arose from the following cause. Just at that period, the processes I have mentioned were flowing particularly, frequently, on just that same continent. These processes occurred partly between different communities and partly within the limits of these communities themselves. And these latter processes afterwards came to be called civil wars. One of the chief causes of these terrible processes, which became frequent both between and within communities on the continent Asia, was at that period a religion, then only just formed, which had been fantastically founded on the teaching of a genuine messenger of our endlessness, Saint Muhammad. The foundation of the said society was then first laid by the brothers of the fraternity, then existing in Central Asia, under the name of the Assembly of the Enlightened. Here it must be noticed that in those days the brothers of this fraternity were beings who were very much venerated by other three-brained beings around them, of almost the whole of that planet, and hence this brotherhood was sometimes also called the Assembly of all the living saints of the earth. This brotherhood of the three-brained terrestrial beings had already long before been formed of such beings who had also noticed in themselves the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, and had banded together to work collectively for their deliverance from these properties. And so, when on their continent Asia, these terrible processes of reciprocal destruction there became already too frequent, certain brothers of the said fraternity, with the most venerable brother Oman Tabur at their head, just decided for the first time to try whether it would not be possible to obtain by some means, if not the total abolition of this terrible phenomenon proceeding on their planet, at least the reduction of this crying evil. Having devoted themselves to the carrying out of this decision of theirs, they then began to visit various countries of the continent Asia, and everywhere, very movingly, preached the colossal criminality and sin of these actions of men, and in this way they found many people earnestly with them. And as a consequence of all their impartial and truly philanthropic labors, there was formed in the city of Mosolopolis the mentioned large and serious society of men beings under the title, "The earth is equally free for all." Already quite from the beginning, the members of this society of men beings actualized to this end many things which no beings of the earth, either before or since, were able to actualize. And they were able to do this only because the program itself from the very beginning was very well drawn up in respect of its actualizability, in the conditions existing there. Among other things, there entered into the fundamental program of this society, gradually to act in such a direction as would enable them to obtain a result. In the first place, the actualization, for all the beings of the continent Asia, of one common religion, which they wished to base upon the teaching of the sect of what are called the Parsis, only changing it a little. Secondly, one common language, and for this common language they wished to adopt what is called the Turkoman language, the oldest on the continent Asia, and one whose roots had already entered into very many Asiatic languages. And thirdly, there entered into the fundamental program of this society, finally to bring about the organization in the center of Asia, namely in the city Margalan, the capital of what was called the Phrygian Khanate, of a chief and basic government for all the countries of Asia under the name of the Council of the Elders, the members of which had to be honorable beings from all the Asiatic communities. It had to be so named because only the oldest and most deservedly honorable beings could participate in it. According to their understanding, only such beings of their planet are able to be impartial and just toward other beings of the earth, irrespective of to what religion or nationality they belong. Among the members of this society, then in the city Masulopolis, there were already beings belonging to almost all the Asiatic communities. Among them were also those called Mongols, Arabs, Kyrgyzs, and Georgians, Little Russians and Tamils, and even the personal representative of the then famous conqueror, Tamerlane. Thanks to their intensive and indeed impartial and unselfish activities, those increasing wars and civil wars on the continent Asia began to diminish, and it was anticipated that many other good things might still be done for this same end. But something just then happened which began the breakup also of the society of effective men-beings of that unparalleled planet. And everything subsequent came about through the influence of a then very famous philosopher, Atarnak, and his theory expounded by him in a treatise under the title, Why Do Wars Occur on the Earth? When this philosopher made his appearance among the members of this society, all their notions were confounded. I know very well the history of this same philosopher, Atarnak, also because during my studies of ever the same consequences of the creations of the most saintly Ashyata Shiyamash, it became necessary for me to learn in detail about his activities also, and of course also about himself. This philosopher, Atarnak, was born in that same city, Masulopolis, in a family of those who are called Kurds. He, on attaining responsible age, became for the planet Earth a very great learned being. In the very beginning, this same Kurd, Atarnak, perseveringly studied during many Earth years every possible question which it seemed to him might give him an answer to the question, what in general is the sense of man's existence? And during his study of these questions, it seems that by some means there fell into his hands a very ancient but well-preserved what is called Sumerian manuscript. This manuscript was well preserved because it had been inscribed on the skins of being snakes called Kalyanjesh with the blood of the being Chirman. As my investigation made clear to me, the contents of this manuscript, inscribed by some ancient being, extremely interested the philosopher Atarnak, who was particularly struck by that place of the manuscript where, as presupposed by this ancient learned being, it was said, in all probability, there exists in the world some law of the reciprocal maintenance of everything existing. Obviously, our lives serve also for maintaining something great or small in the world. This idea expressed in the ancient manuscript so captivated the philosopher Atarnak that thereafter he devoted himself wholeheartedly in the study of only this aspect of the question which had interested him. This idea served as the basis for his whole further plausible theory, which after minute researches during several years and elaborate experimental verifications of his own conclusions, he expounded in his chief work under the name, Why Do Wars Occur on the Earth? I became acquainted also with this theory of his. It was indeed near to reality. All the suppositions of this Kurd, Atarnak, were very similar to the great fundamental cosmic law, Trago Auto Egocrat, existing in our universe, which law I explained to you in more or less detail when I was speaking about the holy planet Purgatory. In this theory of the philosopher Atarnak, it was very definitely proved that there exists in the world, without any doubt, a law of the reciprocal maintenance of everything that exists, and that for this reciprocal maintenance, certain chemical substances also serve, with the help of which the process of the spiritualization of beings, that is to say, life, is carried out, and these chemical substances serve for the maintenance of all that exists only after the given life ceases, that is, when a being dies. With the help of very many elucidatory logical confrontations, it was also fully proved, in the theory of Atarnak, that at certain periods there must infallibly proceed on the earth such a definite quantity of deaths as in their totality will yield vibrations of a definite degree of power. Once, when at a general meeting of the beings members of this society, the earth is equally free for all, this anything but ordinary terrestrial three-brained being, who was also the elected representative from the whole population of the country called Kurdistan, expounded this theory of his very eloquently and in great detail at the request of his fellow members. Then great confusion and agitation proceeded among the members of this society. They were so struck with this theory of his that at first, as is said there, a sepulchral silence prevailed among them for quite a time, and plunged into stupor. None of them could even stir, and only after the lapse of rather a long time, such a great noise and hullabaloo arose among them, as if the saving of each one's life depended on the degree of his excitement and its outer manifestations. The result of it all was that late in the evening of the same day they unanimously decided to elect from their midst several learned beings, jointly, to investigate thoroughly the details of this theory which had struck them, and afterwards to make a detailed report upon it to the General Assembly. From the very next day, those elected, learned members of the society, the earth is equally free for all, very earnestly set to work to familiarize themselves with the theory of this Atarnak. But to the misfortune of all three-brained beings of future times arising on this ill-fated planet, it turned out that although all the elected learned members were also already advanced in years, and those malignant functions which in the beings of the earth make their being, so to say, jealous and greedy, were almost atrophied in them, yet for various reasons, chiefly owing to their abnormal education, certain of them, it seems, had not yet acquired enough ground to be convinced of the non-actualizability of their dreams, which they owed to that notorious abnormal education of theirs, with the result that they were still not yet sufficiently disillusioned to be able to be fully impartial and just. In consequence of this, from that very same day, as they gradually became familiar with the details of this astonishing theory, they began to get into the state of typical beings of the earth. That is to say, they began to forget the extraordinary hypothesis that had struck them, which was mentioned in that theory, and began gradually to return, as is proper to three-brained beings there, to their former, typically subjective, and therefore always changeable conviction, and immediately split into two opposite parties. Some of these began without any logical criticism to take convincingly on faith all the hypotheses made in this theory. Others, however, did not fail, as is in general proper to most of the learned beings of the earth, to speak and to prove quite the opposite of these hypotheses. And, as a result, they worked themselves up into a state of enmity, not only against the theory of Atarnak, but even personally against him himself. In short, my boy, instead of these learned members who were elected for the detailed study of the theory of Atarnak, helping the other members of their society to get out of their confusion and agitation and to unify their disputes among themselves, they brought still more bewilderment into their notions, and gradually, in the common presence of each separate member of this earnest society, data began to arise automatically for two totally opposite convictions. The first of these convictions was that everything takes place precisely according to the theory of the philosopher Atarnak. That is to say, that there must necessarily proceed wars and civil wars on the earth, quite independently of the personal consciousness of men. And the second conviction was that which all the members of the society had already previously had, namely, that if they succeeded in carrying out the program which their society had set itself, this evil also which proceeded on their planet might be destroyed root and branch, and everything might proceed in a desirable way. It was just from that time that discussions, quarrels, and disturbances arose among all the members of that society. And in this case also the same began to proceed as I already mentioned, and as had in general long before become customary there. Those quarrels and disturbances of theirs gradually spread also among the ordinary beings there, in this case to the citizens of the city Masulopolis, and were the cause of the inflaming of their abnormal psyche. And I do not know how all this would have ended if the brothers of the society, the assembly of the enlightened, had not also just then arrived there and had not taken a hand in this affair. Thanks to their influence, all the members of this serious society gradually calmed down and started anew, peaceably and seriously, to ponder and deliberate upon just what to do in the future. The result of all their serious deliberations and ponderings was that they unanimously elected Atarnak as their chief director and begged him to help them to find an issue from this situation. After several meetings, already directed by the Kurd philosopher Atarnak himself, the following categorical conclusion was unanimously arrived at. According to the laws of nature, there must periodically always proceed on the earth, independently of the will of men, wars and civil wars, and this is because during certain periods there is required for nature a greater quantity of deaths. In view of this, we are all, with much grief, but with inevitable inner resignation, compelled to agree that by no mental decisions of man is it possible to abolish the shedding of blood between states and within states themselves. And we therefore unanimously resolve to wind up current affairs and everything done by our society, and perforce disperse for home, and there to drag out our inescapable burden of life. It was only after this categorical resolution was proposed, when all the members, without exception, of that indeed serious society decided to begin that same day the complete liquidation of all their affairs. Only then did that, in the opinion held there, truly learned, though very proud and self-loving Kurd Atarnak, ascend the cathedra and speak as follows. My honorable colleagues, I am very sincerely grieved that I have unintentionally been the cause of the dissolution of this great philanthropic undertaking into which you, the most honorable and wise of all the countries of the earth, have for several years put more impartial and unselfish labor than men of the earth have ever been or ever again will be able to bear for others, that is, for men quite unknown and indifferent to them. You have labored unceasingly for some years to obtain for the masses the most necessary welfare, and although I too have worked upon my theory for many years, also for people unknown to me, nevertheless it has been the cause of the frustration of your indefatigable labors and benevolent aspirations. The consciousness that it seems that I am to blame for all the misunderstandings which have arisen among you has given me no peace during these last days, and I have been thinking and pondering all the time whether it is not possible somehow to repair this involuntary fault of mine. And so, wise colleagues, elected from the whole earth, I wish to share with you the final conclusion to which these deliberations of mine have brought me. If the universal laws I have discovered are opposed to the means you expected might bring a certain happiness to mankind, then, however strange it may seem to you at first glance, if only these same laws be employed otherwise, they might serve for the attainment of this aim we have set for ourselves. Now listen to what we must do to attain this aim. The results of all my researches clearly prove that nature requires that at certain periods a certain number of deaths should take place on the earth, and at the same time I have succeeded in making clear that for the needs of nature it is indifferent which deaths these are, whether deaths of people themselves or deaths of the lives of other forms of beings. From this it follows that if the number of deaths required by nature is made up by the deaths of other forms of lives of the earth, then obviously the need for the number of deaths of men themselves will thus be of itself correspondingly reduced. And it will be quite possible to attain to this if all the members of our society continue to work with the same intensity, only not with the aim of realizing our former program, but of reviving upon the earth on a larger scale than before the ancient custom among men of offering sacrifices to their gods and saints by destroying the lives of other forms. When this proud Kurd had finished his speech, there arose among the members of the society, the earth is equally free for all, an astonishment and agitation not less than on the occasion when he had first expounded his famous theory. For nearly 3 days and 3 nights following that memorable day, they scarcely adjourned, but in the halls that had been put by the citizens of Mosulapolis at the disposal of this all-planetary society of men beings, there was a continuous rumble of discussion and deliberation. At last, on the 4th day, an official general meeting was convened, at which, by general consent, a resolution was carried to do in the future also everything exactly as should be indicated by the great Kurd, the philosopher Atarnak. And on that same day, the name of that society was changed. Some days later, the members of that society, now under the new motto, the earth only for men, dispersed from the city of Mosulapolis to their native countries where, under the general instructions issuing from the philosopher Atarnak, they so acted that among the populations of the continent Asia, the idea should be strengthened, and again take root of making themselves agreeable to their gods and idols by killing beings of different forms. And indeed, afterward, when they began to actualize in practice this new program of theirs, there very soon began to be re-established among the beings all over the continent Asia the custom of offering sacrifices to their fancied saints by the destruction of the existence of various weak and stupid one-brained and two-brained beings there. From the beginning, the members of this new society, the earth only for men, began to actualize this task of theirs for the most part through what are called the clergy of that religion which was formed upon the teaching of Saint Mohammed, and which at that period was very widely spread over the whole continent Asia. And this custom was adopted this time on a larger scale than it had been when, at the request of the angel Luisos, I descended there to try to do what I could to destroy that same custom among the three-brained beings there, which seemed at that time to his conformity very undesirable for cosmic phenomena of a greater scale, because during all this time the number of your favorites had greatly increased, and consequently the number also had increased of those anxious to give pleasure to their fantastic idols. The destruction of the existence of other forms of beings was resumed there, not only privately in houses, among their families, but also publicly in special places. But this time these special places were chiefly associated, in a certain respect, with the memory of Saint Mohammed, or with those around him. The number of these slaughterers increased there by year to year, to such an extent that already only some 100 or so of their years after the time of the arising of the society, the earth only for men, the number had amounted during one of their years in one single place alone to 100,000 of such beings as they had sacrificed in previous times, namely oxen, sheep, camels, and so on. During the last 2 centuries, such special honored favorite places were the cities Mecca and Medina in Arabia, the city Meshed in the locality called Baghdad, the environs of Yeninishlak in Turkestan, and several others. In a word, there on the continent Asia, blood, again, flowed like a river. These sacrificial offerings were most frequent during the Mohammedan feasts called Bairam and Qurban, and likewise during the Christian feasts existing there under the name of Shrovetide and St. George's Day, and so on. In this way, my boy, afterward, when, thanks to these strenuous efforts of the members of the society, the earth only for men, there had again been implanted in three-brained beings there such an abnormality, then these terrible processes of theirs began indeed to proceed there less often and on a smaller scale, and through this the sporadic, relatively great, what is called mortality, was diminished. Yet the general mortality of the three-brained beings was not only not reduced by this, but even increased, since owing to the continued progressive deterioration of their being existence, and in consequence owing to the deterioration of the quality of the radiative vibrations of their presences in the process of their existence required from them by nature, the length of their existence, on the one hand, was still further diminished, and on the other hand, their what is called birth rate was increased. So it continued until that time when a certain famous Asadullah Ibrahim Ogli, a Persian dervish who obtained his arising and who was formed into a responsible being on that same continent, turned all this in another direction. The dervish Asadullah Ibrahim Ogli began his activities there only some 30 or 40 terrestrial years ago, being simply only a fanatic of the Mohammedan religion, without that serious and deeply learned knowledge possessed by the Kurd Atarnak. He perceived in the custom of sacrificial offerings only horrible injustice on the part of the people toward beings of other forms, and he set as the aim of his existence to obtain, at whatever cost, the destruction on the earth of this, in his opinion, anti-religious custom. Having begun from that time to wander on the continent Asia, chiefly in those countries where the greater part of the three-brained beings were the followers of the Mohammedan religion, he began to work mainly through dervishes like himself, who are to be found in almost all the communities there on the continent Asia. This ingenious and energetic Persian dervish, Asadullah Ibrahim Ogli, here, there, and everywhere, very cleverly persuaded these other dervishes of the truth of his idea, and these, in their turn, now everywhere, persuaded the ordinary beings of the continent Asia that the destruction of the existence of beings of other forms is not only not pleasing to God, but that the destroyers would even be obliged to bear, in another world, in hell, a double punishment, one for their own, what are called sins, and one for the sins of the beings destroyed by them, and so on. And thanks to preachings of this kind about the other world by dervishes considered great authorities on such questions, the beings of Asia did indeed year by year diminish their sacrificial offerings. In short, the result of all the activity of this good Persian dervish was precisely the latest great process of reciprocal destruction, or as your favorites call it, the Great World War. And so, my boy, although the hypothesis put forward in the theory of that uncommon learned Kurd Atarnak very nearly, as I have already told you, approximated to reality, yet nevertheless he failed to understand what was most important, namely, that the vibrations required by nature, which have to be formed from the radiations issuing from beings both during their existence as well as from the process of their rasguarno, have no significance quantitatively, but only qualitatively. It is possible that the Kurd Atarnak, being an unusual terrestrial being, would have understood this also if he had known the details of the results that had been obtained after those conditions of being existence had been already more or less established on this planet, which were especially created for the three-brained beings arising there by the most saintly labors of the essence-loving, very saintly Ashyada Shamash. During that said period, not only did their rate of mortality begin to decline, but what they call their birth rate also began to decline. Their birth rate declined because when the three-brained beings there were already existing, more or less, as is becoming to three-centered beings, and when the radiations issuing from them were yielding vibrations more akin to the vibrations required from them by nature, both for the most great common cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat in general, and for the maintenance of the moon and Anulios in particular, then great nature did not fail to adapt herself to the diminishing of their birth rate, the more so as in recent times the need for the said vibrations for the maintenance of the existence of the planet Moon had to be diminished. The aspect of this fundamental question regarding the significance of the sense and aim of the existence of your favorites is so important for the understanding of a great deal that proceeds there on the earth, and, by the way, also of the question touching the causes of war, that I consider it necessary to refer to it once more. I first learned that the destiny of beings arising on this planet of yours is chiefly to elaborate, by means of the process of their existence, the vibrations required by nature for the maintenance of those former parts of the planet now called Moon and Anulios. When, do you remember, I became worthy personally to converse for the second time with his conformity, the then still angel, but now archangel, Luisos. His conformity then told me that although the movements of both former parts of the planet Earth were now already finally regulated with a general harmony of movement, and that every kind of apprehension of some or other surprise in the near future had absolutely vanished, yet to avoid any possible complications in the distant future, it had been explicitly decided by the Most High, most sacred individuals, to actualize the corresponding on the planet for the formation of what is called the sacred Askokin, so that this sacred cosmic substance required for the maintenance of that planet's former parts might continuously issue from that planet. And further, His Highness also explained that this cosmic substance, the sacred Askokin, exists in general in the universe, chiefly blended with the sacred substance Abrust Donis and Helkdonis, and hence that this sacred substance Askokin, in order to become vivifying for such a maintenance, must first be freed from the said sacred substance Abrust Donis and Helkdonis. To tell the truth, my boy, I did not at once clearly understand all that he then said, and it was only later that I came to understand it all clearly, when during my studies of the fundamental cosmic laws, I learned that these sacred substances, Abrus-Donis and Helk-Donis, are just those substances by which the higher being bodies of three-brained beings, namely the body Kesdjan and the body of the soul, are in general formed and perfected. And when I learned that the separation of the sacred Askokin from the said sacred substances proceeds in general when the beings on whatever planet it might be transubstantiate the sacred substances Abrus-Donis and Helk-Donis in themselves for the forming and perfecting of their higher bodies by means of conscious labors and intentional sufferings. And when I had become interested in these favorites of yours, and had begun to observe and to study their strange psyche, only then did I finally understand to which end both Great Nature herself and the most high and most saintly individuals always patiently adapt themselves to everything, and concerning this, the following personal opinion was formed in me: that if these favorites of yours would at least properly ponder over this, and serve nature honestly in this respect, then perhaps their being self-perfecting might as a consequence proceed automatically, even without the participation of their consciousness. And in any case, the poor nature of their ill-fated planet would also not have to puff and blow in order to adapt herself to remain within the common cosmic harmony. But unfortunately for everything existing in the megalocosmos, there is no honesty in your favorites, even in respect of the fulfillment of their duties to nature, not even to that nature to which, strictly speaking, they owe their very existence. As regards the absence of honesty in your favorites in the fulfillment of their duty towards nature, I have just now remembered a very wise sentence of our incomparable teacher Mullah Nasr ad-Din, which in the present case justifies its hidden meaning. He once said, "Plague and cholera are, at any rate, less ignoble than human honesty, since people with a conscience can at least live at peace with them." And so, my dear Hassin, when it appeared that the instinctive need for conscious labor and intentional suffering, in order to be able to take in and transmute in themselves the sacred substances Abrus-Donis and Helk-Donis, and thereby to liberate the sacred Askokim for their maintenance of the moon and Anulios, had finally disappeared from the psyche of your favorites, then Great Nature herself was constrained to adapt herself to extract the sacred substance by other means, one of which is precisely that periodic, terrifying process there of reciprocal destruction. Here, for the correct valuation of your contemporary favorites, it will be apropos to remind you that after the action of the organ Kundabuffer had been destroyed in the three-brained beings of your planet, the first generations very soon learned that a certain cosmic substance had to be transformed through them, and that their assistance in this transformation was one of their chief being duties. Do you remember, I have told you that the beings of the continent Atlantis even considered this being duty of theirs as sacred, and called it Amarlus, which in their language means help to the moon. The three-brained beings of the continent Atlantis of that period, namely the period then called the Samliosian civilization, even devised and very strictly practiced certain customs that greatly contributed to the fulfillment of those being duties as productively as possible. The beings of the continent Atlantis even very wisely and expediently devised the fulfillment of these two being duties, namely the duty of the perfecting of their higher bodies and the duty of serving the most great cosmic Trago-Auto-Egocrat, by uniting them into one and performing them simultaneously. And this union they organized in the following way. In every populated locality, and even in separate districts of these localities, 3 very substantial, indispensable special buildings were erected there. One, for the beings of the male sex, was called Agurok Rostini. The second building, especially for beings of the female sex, was called Gaina Kokrostani, and the third for such beings as were then called the middle sex. This sacred building was called Anoro Parionikima. The first two of these substantial buildings were then considered sacred by the beings of the continent Atlantis, and these buildings were for them the same as their temples, churches, chapels, and other sacred places are for the contemporary beings of the earth. When I descended for the first time on that planet and was on the continent Atlantis, I personally visited certain of these buildings, and at that time became very well acquainted with their purpose. In the male temples, namely in the Agurokrostani, beings of the male sex of the given locality or of the given district performed, in turn, corresponding mysteries while in the special state called self-remembering. The beings of the continent Atlantis had a definite notion that beings of the male sex are sources of active manifestation, and hence, in their Agurokrostani, they gave themselves up to active and conscious contemplation the whole time, and in this state performed these corresponding sacred mysteries, so that there should be transubstantiated in them the sacred substances Abrusdonis and Helkdonis. And they did this deliberately and with full consciousness, in order that this certain sacred substance, liberated in them and issuing through their radiations for its further vivifyingness, should become the active part of that sacred law which they call the Holy Trinity. In the sacred Gynecokrostani, built for the beings of the female sex, each of these beings were obliged at certain periods, namely at those periods which contemporary beings call menstruation, to stay without leaving. Moreover, the women, acknowledging themselves to be passive beings, had to be the whole time of their stay there only passive, in order that the vibrations issuing through their radiations should serve as the passive part of that same sacred law for their further vivifyingness. And hence they passed their whole time in these Gynecokrostani in a state of complete passivity, trying consciously not to think about anything. With this aim in view, they tried to have no active experiencings during their monthly states, and in order that thoughts flowing by association should not hinder them from concentrating, everything was arranged so that their thoughts should be directed the whole time to wishing well to their present or future children. And as regards the third kind of the buildings of the beings of that time, which were called Anura Parionikima, as I already told you, the beings then called the third sex, for whom these buildings were erected, our Mullah Nasr ad-Din would call misconceptions, or beings who are neither one thing nor another. Among these middle sex beings were beings both of the male sex and the female sex. These were beings who, for various reasons, already lacked the possibility either of perfecting themselves or serving nature. They were, as is said in the saying of our same Mullah Nasr ad-Din, neither a candle for the angel nor a poker for the devil. Those beings of the male sex were put into these houses for a certain time, who, for some reason or other, were already entirely deprived of the possibility of ever consciously contemplating. And of the number of the beings of the female sex, those were placed in them who generally either did not menstruate at all, or in whom menstruation occurred abnormally. Likewise, those who, in the sense of their sexual desires, became transformed, at certain periods, into, as was said there, Naniomani, or, as our dear Mullah would say, into veritable mares in the spring. Among the beings then on the continent Atlantis, conceptions of several definite, very peculiar symptoms were current, according to which the given beings were recognized and confined in the Anoro Parionikima. And these symptoms were as follows. 1. If a being believed in any kind of balderdash. 2. If a being began to prove to others anything about which he himself knew nothing whatsoever, or was not sure of. 3. If a being failed to keep his word of honor or took his oath in vain. 4. And finally, if there appeared in any being tendencies to spy upon the others, and to be occupied with tuksukef. But the most conclusive symptom of all was when that property appeared in somebody which was then called moyusu, and which contemporary beings already consider an illness and call hemorrhoids. In these anaroparionakima, beings of this kind were obliged to remain without stirring from them during those periods indicated by the surrounding beings. But they were under no compulsion to do anything, but existed as they liked. In regard to them, there was only one aim, that they neither met nor spoke with normal beings of the given locality. Such beings were then confined in these buildings because, according to the notions then, they, at certain periods of the month, thanks to these various taints of theirs, interfered by their radiations with the quiet and regular existence of the surrounding beings. Yes, indeed, my dear boy, beings of the later period of the existence of the continent Atlantis had already many very good customs for normal being existence. But as regards the contemporary beings of your planet, one can only pity them, because owing to the second great calamity to their ill-fated planet, the said continent, with everything upon it, entered into the planet, and with it there disappeared also all those good customs for ordinary existence, which had gradually, during long centuries, entered into the process of their ordinary existence. After that continent of Atlantis had perished, the custom was again on the point of being re-established among later three-brained beings there, of having special constructions similar to those of which I have just told you for the process of ordinary existence. The need for these special buildings was again understood, and they were actualized by a very sensible Hebrew king named Solomon. And that special building, which this sensible Hebrew king decided first of all to construct, and which still continued long afterwards among his subjects, was called Takchanan. They somewhat resembled the gynecocrostini, such as had existed in Atlantis, and beings also of the female sex were put into them, and they were obliged to remain there during the whole of their menstruation. The King Solomon hastened then to establish this custom, because during his wise reign he had often constated that when beings of the female sex experienced the state of menstruation, their character became for the surrounding beings, especially for their husbands, not only intolerable, but in respect of resulting inconsistent relations and dealings with other beings like themselves, even psycho-organically harmful. And he therefore decided without delay to promulgate a severe law for his subjects, according to which special isolated buildings were compulsorily constructed near every populated district, in which to confine the beings of the female sex for the whole duration of their said state. I even chanced to read the law he promulgated. In this law it was said, among other things, that women during their menstruation are, in the consecrated sense, unclean, and that during these periods, for others, and especially for their husbands, not only to touch them, but to speak with them, is the highest sacrilege and a crime. An unclean force or evil spirit will enter into those husbands or into men in general who touch or even speak with them during this period, in consequence of which there would be among men in their everyday relations and affairs only misunderstandings, quarrels, and enmity. This last statement of this great earth sage, King Solomon, remains today an unchangeable truth. And indeed, at the present time, this also is one of the numerous causes, thanks to which, in the general complexity, ordinary existence has already become nonsensical in the extreme for the beings of your planet. In the contemporary earth beings of the female sex, there is still further increased during these states that specific property of theirs which was acquired in them during recent centuries and which they call hysteria. And during this state of theirs, they bring surrounding beings, particularly their husbands, to this, that the latter become like those beings there of whom our great Mullah Nasr ad-Din says, the purpose of their existence is to be the victims of leeches. And indeed, it is only because the contemporary beings of the female sex go about freely during menstruation that many contemporary beings of the male sex not only can never have good and kind relations with each other, but on account of this very frequently become genuine what are called later repenting blasphemers. This favorable custom, created by the wise King Solomon, existed among the Hebrew people for a considerable time and would certainly have been spread all over the earth also, had it not been for that specific property of the beings there about which I have also already once told you. Namely, when this Hebrew people, as usually happens there, had fallen from their greatness and were despised and persecuted by the beings of other communities, who on account of the impulses of jealousy and envy of all those higher than themselves, hated her in the days of her greatness and power, which impulses had already become inherent in the three-brained beings of your planet, then these beings of other communities, of course, also despised all the indeed good customs which they had already had. That is why this good custom was not only not spread further, but gradually, also owing to their other characteristic properties, which I have already sufficiently explained to you. That is to say, owing to the fact that this Hebrew people had themselves fallen under the influence of other communities, which had become great, and had followed their examples, this good custom began to be despised and was ultimately forsaken and forgotten by the very founders themselves. At the present time, this custom exists there only among a very small community, to be found in the mountains of the Caucasus, and bearing the name Kevsuri, just those same Kevsuri who give many scientists there no sleep because of the problem of the origin of that small community. As regards your favorites also destroying the good customs for ordinary existence already existing on their planet and attained by their ancestors, we must, like it or not, again express our condolence with poor nature there who must always be adapting and readapting herself. And concerning a misfortune of this kind, for their nature, our very dear teacher, the peerless Mullah Nasr ad-Din, has also some very wise sentences. Namely, in similar misfortunes, he sometimes says, if you're unlucky in life, you may even be infected by your godmother with venereal disease. Or, sometimes he also says, oh, you unfortunate creature, your mother must have sung an Armenian ballad while you were being born. Even the interpreter of Russian wisdom, Kuzma Proutkov, has good sayings for such a case. The unluckiest among us is the fir cone, because every mocker stumbles over it. I repeat, this unfortunate nature of the planet Earth must continuously and without respite adapt herself to manifest always otherwise, and yet again otherwise, so as to remain within the common cosmic harmony. In order that you may represent to yourself and understand well in what way unfortunate nature there so adapts herself, that there should be attained what is called the equilibrium of vibrations required from this planet for the common cosmic harmony, I shall explain to you only about one fact which is just now being actualized there. That is to say, subsequent to that process of theirs which they called the World War. It was plainly owing to the fact that during the said process, what is called poison gas was invented by beings called Germans, and what are called special rapid-fire machine guns, by beings called Englishmen, that the amount of rasguarnos, or deaths, unforeseen by nature, took place on this occasion, and in a far greater quantity than was then required by her, or, as the candidates for Hasnamus there, namely the commercial businessmen, would say, overproduction, occurred in respect of the deaths of the three-brained beings required there. In consequence, nature there had again to begin from that moment to puff and blow, and, as is said there, jump out of her skin, in order to correct this unforeseeniness and adapt herself once again in a corresponding manner. This time, from what I myself learned for certain during my last stay there, and also from the intimation communicated to me by etherogram, great nature there is evidently about to increase, for future times, the birth rate of other forms of beings there. I noticed in the cities of Petrograd and Tiflis, situated in the large community Russia, of which community more beings perished than of any other during that world war of theirs, that kind of quadruped being which as a rule never appeared there, namely the quadruped beings which hate people and which are called wolves, were already prowling in the streets. In the information communicated to me by etherogram, it was said, among other things, that in the same large community Russia, the birth rate of beings of the kinds of rodents called mice and rats had increased to such an unprecedented extent that at the present time they are beginning to devour most of the stored provisions of the beings of the said community. It was further conveyed in the same etherogram that the power-possessing beings of the community Russia had applied to the beings of another European community to undertake the destruction of the existence of those small beings, mice and rats, which had multiplied among them, in return for which they promised to pay them as much money as it would cost. Though a temporary reduction of the numbers of these poor rats and mice may be obtained by the various means at the disposal of those specialists in the destruction of the existences of others, yet the beings of the other communities will possibly not quite consent to do this gratis. To pay in money, however, this the beings of that Russia who promised it will, of course, not be able to do, since it might cost them in money much more than their last war. And to get money from the same sources from which they drained it during that great process, as our dear Mullah Nasser ad-Din says, as to this nothing doing, even a donkey can understand that peasant flesh costs nothing in peacetime. Having said this, Beelzebub became silent and began to look expectantly at his grandson, who, as if talking to himself very sadly, in a tone full of despair, said, "How will it all end? Is there really no way out at all? Must these unfortunate souls who were formed on that unfortunate planet really remain eternally unperfected and be endlessly coded into various planetary forms and everlastingly toil and moil on account of the consequences of the properties of that accursed organ Kundabuffer, which, owing to the reasons extraneous to them themselves, was attached to the planetary bodies of the first three-centered beings of that ill-fated planet? Where, then, is that pillar upon which, as it were, our whole megalocosmos rests, and which is called justice? No, this cannot be. Something is wrong here, because during the whole time of my existence, not once has a single doubt ever crept into me as to the existence of objective justice. All I have to do is just to clarify and understand why. At any rate, from this present moment, the aim of my existence shall be to understand clearly why the souls arising in these terrestrial, three-centered beings are in such an unprecedented, terrifying situation. Having said this, poor Hassin, full of melancholy, drooped his head and became sadly thoughtful. And Beelzebub looked at him with a very strange look. Strange because in this look his love for Hassin was very clearly seen, and at the same time it could be sensed that he was nevertheless very glad that his grandson was experiencing such a depression. This silence continued a fairly long time. At last Beelzebub heaved a deep sigh with, as it were, the whole of his essence, and spoke to his grandson in the following words. "Yes, my dear Hassin, certainly there is something not quite right here. But if nothing could be done for the beings of that planet, by that being who now already has the reason of the sacred Podkulad, and is one of the first assistants of our endlessness in the government of the world, namely, the very saintly Ashyata Shiyamash, if he could do nothing, what then can we expect, we beings with the reason of almost ordinary beings?" You remember the very saintly Ashyata Shiyamash, then in his deliberations, under the title, The Terror of the Situation, said, "If it is possible to save the beings of the earth, then time alone can do it." We can now only repeat the same in regard to this terrible property of theirs, of which we have just been speaking, namely, their periodic processes of the destruction of each other's existence. We can only say now that if this property of terrestrial beings is to disappear from that unfortunate planet, then it will be with time alone, thanks either to the guidance of a certain being with very high reason, or to certain exceptional cosmic events. Having said this, Beelzebub again began to look at Hassin with that same strange look.